Good afternoon and welcome to our first seminar in the second part of our series, The Power of Humour. Jenna and I have a very exciting program of speakers kind of lined up for this semester, including our very own star comedian, a comedian at last on a humour seminar. It's pretty nice. That's Donovan Goliath, but more on that later. So to start the program, we're very happy to welcome Dr. Chris Kramer. I'll introduce Chris quickly, and Jenna will guide us through the discussion at the end. So please post questions in the chat or indicate there that you'd like to speak, and Jenna will invite you into the conversation as we go along. So Chris teaches philosophy at Santa Barbara City College in California in the US. And he's very kindly agreed to speak to us at what is the absolute crack of dawn for him. So we should also thank his partner Lynne, and as he says, his two diminutive philosophers, Milo and Lola, for putting up with all of us. Chris's interests intersect across the philosophies of humour, mind, religion, informal logic, existentialism and phenomenology, and oppression. He wrote a PhD on subversive humour, which he tells us is half about humour and the other half about oppression. And it's aimed at making us both laugh and cry. And this is reflected in the title of his presentation, which is Mirth over Madness, even when oppression makes a wise man mad. So in the presentation, he promises to analyze the use of humor as an unexpected tool in the fight against forms of oppression. So in other words, he'll be looking at subversive humor as what he calls positive propaganda and parrhesia, courage, truth-telling, or courageous truth-telling in the face of powerful people or institutions. So he'll consider the surprising humor of Frederick Douglass under the overt oppression of slavery, and he will look at the insightful narrative jokes from Dave Chappelle under the covert oppression of everyday racism. And he argues that for this kind of humor, you need an intermingling of emotion and cognition. There's a kind of a mixed emotional element of justifiable rage, which is the crying part, and empathic outreach, which I think would be the laughter part. There's also a mixed cognitive element. On the negative crying side, there is critical undermining of propaganda and conspiracism. And on the affirmative laughing side, there's an element of collaborative, playful reasoning. So I'm getting prepared to both cry and laugh with you, Chris. Thanks again for joining us so early, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, I'll share my screen. The laughter and crying part, the crying was mostly because you would be reading a dissertation, and that would be what should cause tears. But hopefully there will just be laughter for today. Thank you very much for having me here. I've enjoyed watching, granted they're all the recordings thus far. I've not been able to get up at 3 a.m. my time, which I think is when they're scheduled. But I've really enjoyed, and I think I've gotten quite a bit from the previous seminars. And I think this is a fantastic, it seems to be a year-long seminar on the power of humor. So I'm really happy to be a part of this. So the title, Mirth over Madness, even when oppression makes a wise man mad, that is from Frederick Douglass. And it is odd to connect the outrages of oppression with humor. I know this is odd because every time I mention that I'm interested in humor and oppression, people oftentimes say, yeah, I can see how humor could help with depression, which is connected, but that's not what I'm going to focus upon. Mad in this context, in the title, is ambiguous. Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave, an abolitionist, then became a public speaker, the most photographed American of the 19th century, as it turns out. For just a little trivia there, The concept mad is ambiguous. I think he's using it in the sense of a loss of sanity in the face of horrible and irrational acts of subjugation. And of course, he's enraged. There are parallels here with Frantz Fanon's response to colonialism in his Black Skin, White Masks. He says, I was up against something unreasoned. I would personally say that for a man whose only weapon is reason, there's nothing more neurotic than contact with unreason. And he goes on. I'm not going to quote. I'll have a number of quotes and I'll leave them up in the interest of time. I will also talk about them. So one of the questions I want to ask here is how to respond to something like this unreasoned neurotic element that comes with certain kinds of oppressions. What I will call subversive humor is not on the face of it rational, but neither is it irrational. It straddles the borders of many spaces, the rational, irrational, in the linguistic realm with meaning and nonsense, marginalized groups, and what's often referred to as the hegemonic center between logic and emotion, seriousness and playfulness, and so on. And we'll go cover some of these in this talk. It is this maneuverability, malleability, and ambiguity that is largely what grants subversive humorists their power. Some in this actual series have called it a soft power. And I think that makes sense when it is used against hard forms of oppression, so that Douglas and Fanon faced, certainly asymmetrical power. But it's less obvious so when the oppression is covert, when it is hidden behind the soft smile of a self-professed egalitarian. Someone who says things like, Colin Powell speaks so well. Just a reminder for the international audience, I'll have to keep reminding myself this. Colin Powell is a former general, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of State, and at one time considered running for the president of the United States. So yeah, he speaks so well. Being president of the United States, by the way, is not a guarantee that you speak well, just to clarify that point. But let me make this quick point to jump ahead. The comedian Chris Rock, he makes this point explicit. Andrea, I probably should have mentioned there's some salty language. I should have warned you. He's making this explicit. I'll talk about this. I hope that's okay, Andrea.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. I'll be mentioning and quoting. I won't be using such language. And I'm not going to act out this performance, but it is a performance. And if you look at the language, it seems incongruous, to use a term that's commonly used among humor theorists with respect to what makes something funny, because he's responding, as you see in the bolded text, in a way that seems completely disproportionate to the infraction, which is, hey, I'm just complimenting somebody. But he makes the point, as comedians oftentimes do, with analogies, with a kind of exaggerated hyperbolic representation that highlights the particular point. And he might, in the question and answer, perhaps we can talk more about the concept of intersectionality and the relationship that Chris Rock has with respect to, as he says, speaks so well is not a compliment. That's some stuff you say about, certain groups of people. He could have made this just as funny by saying that's some shit you say about, 2-year-olds that can talk, for example. But that's, I think, separate to the point I'm making here. He's making it clear. And I think he's angry. And even though this is a performance and he's done it multiple times, I think you sense the anger there. And it's presented in a way that is performative and playful at the same time. The playfulness and the anger don't cancel each other out. And that can be positive and negative. My focus is going to be on humor as a response to anti-Black racism, but this analysis, I think, can be extended to other manifestations of oppression. And I should also note, this is a theoretical, descriptive account of such uses of humor. It's not prescriptive. I'm not saying for those who are oppressed that they should just seek a good joke to attack their oppressors. So the first form of oppression that I want to address is that which we've addressed a little bit already: European colonialism, American slavery, the genocidal policies in the Americas against the indigenous peoples, which, at least with respect to the Catholic Church in Canada, we start to see perhaps finally some, well, more than recognition that that was a reality. You see it in John Gast's famous painting here, American Progress, where there's a subtext to it that says, and the animals and natives flee. You get a sense of they're leaving, they're equated with animality, with savages. And you see it in our very presidents. Andrew Jackson, who was lauded a great deal, perhaps too much, by our previous president. You see the quote from Andrew Jackson, and he made good on those promises. And indigenous peoples, Native Americans in the United States today are still suffering from these explicit policies. These are legally, economically sanctioned, violently enforced. They're top-down, consciously intended, usually racially motivated types of exploitation and oppression. This is different, I think, from a lot of the sorts that we see today that is typically covert, systemic, institutionalized, implicit, and here's an interesting moral conundrum, consciously unendorsed by many well-meaning people, as we'll see, through stereotypes, policies, and otherwise nice egalitarian woke folk, if you ask them. And maybe we talk more about woke. I don't know how far that term has made it. It's like so many terms that lose their nuance. It had an origination, and it had it in African-American culture. The musician Ledbetter, in fact, was one who coined it, I believe, or at least used it publicly. It doesn't mean what he meant anymore, and we could talk about that later. There's multiple examples. Our history in America is rife with examples of explicit, the Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow. You see it with individual acts of racism. This is just one example of a horrible murder perpetrated by John William King against James Burr Jr. in Texas. He dragged him behind his pickup truck, and just awful. But this, I think, is what most people think of racism, at least in the United States. It's one individual acting in a particular way based on racial animosity toward another individual. And that's true. There is that. We still have that today in groups like this. But the individualized notion of racism is only a subset. And in fact, this is probably, at least today, a much smaller subset than the more systemic problems that are that have just as awful consequences in many cases. And again, this was in the 1990s, I believe, and here we are in 2017. You have well-dressed fraternity boys, it seems, chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and "blood and soil." This guy here was interviewed. I don't know if you can see my cursor. He was interviewed afterward and said, I had no idea what they were chanting, but he's chanting something. And so he's not that confused. And this fellow here is not waving to his family members, I suspect. In these particular cases, there's a sense in which that kind of oppression, that kind of racism, systemic, there's no confusion about who's harming who and why. And so, in fact, in some cases, it's so obvious that constructing straightforward arguments against this kinds of oppression, as Douglas himself claims, would be to make myself look ridiculous and offer an insult to your understanding, end quote. So Douglas opts for a kind of asymmetrical tactic, scorching irony or humor-infused anger. In his "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," he attempts to open what he calls the eyes of the lovers of ease. This is an interesting phrase that I think could connect with Friedrich Nietzsche. These are individuals, this country, celebrating the independence, freedom, the all-around greatness of the nation. His rhetoric, Douglas's, critiques the inconsistencies between American ideals that are declared. He'll use this word, declared, quite often. We see it in our founding documents, in fact. The inconsistencies between these declarations of equality and the real world lived experiences. This lived experiences phrase has become predominant in politics as well. That's an existentialist concept. But these experiences of most of its population for most of the country's existence. And here I quote from Charles Mills, the philosopher. He says, for over 80% of US history, its laws declared most of the world's population to be ineligible for full American citizenship solely because of their race, original nationality, or gender, end quote. That is identity politics, which is another phrase common in the US. A certain segment of the political population here doesn't like identity politics, which is seen today as people saying this group of individuals needs some redress from the wrongs of the past, talking about communities, identities based upon membership of particular groups, as opposed to saying we're just individuals. We could talk more about that later. But it is, as some might say, rich that people are saying, quit playing identity politics when this nation is built upon, as just noted, a kind of identity politics that was exclusionary. So how do we respond to this? One way Douglas responds is to recognize that straightforward argument, straightforward protest is insufficient. Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he's the rightful owner of his own body? Well, you've already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Think about what he's saying. Do I need to give you an argument? This is absurd, he thinks. To do so would be, as I quoted earlier, to make myself look ridiculous, offer an insult to your understanding. There's not a man beneath the canopy of heaven who does not know that slavery is wrong for him at a time like this. Scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed, end quote. I'm going to make the case that he's advocating for a mode of consciousness raising and resistance that's later championed by Michel Foucault, and that term is parrhesia. Foucault defines it this way. It's a kind of verbal activity in which the speaker expresses his personal relationship to the truth, although that has another meaning today as well, and risks his life because he recognizes truth-telling as a duty to improve or help other people. And the quote goes on. One sense of the term might be free speech. This parrhesia is a kind of free speech, which is an irony that would not have been lost on Douglas, whose words could freely travel across the globe, while Douglas the man remained subjugated in his own country. He was able to go on speaking tours in Europe, in fact, and publish in his autobiographies later on, while still under threat of being returned to his master in a kind of absurd situation, as he recognized. Parrhesia ultimately means to tell the truth. It is, as Foucault puts it, quote, a form of criticism. The Parhesiastes is always less powerful than the one with whom he or she speaks. Parrhesia comes from below, as it were, and is directed towards above, end quote. In these ways, Douglas is akin to a philosopher who criticizes a tyrant or tyrants, and is, I think, an exemplar of the Parhesiastes, but with an additional element that Foucault does not consider, and that is subversive humor. Part of Douglas's effective rhetoric, I think, comes from this, his sense of humor. He's, as he points out in his autobiographies, I've been greatly helped to bear up under unfriendly conditions by a constitutional tendency to see the funny side of things. There's a lot more to that than just I can find, look on the bright side of life, as Monty Python might put it. Oh, now I've forgotten the song. I was going to sing the song. You all know the song. I'm not going to do it now. His humor has a double effect, I think. It acts as a buffer for him against the absurdities of the peculiar institution, which is what the Southerners called it. The fact that they called it that tells you they know something's up, that it is indeed peculiar. This is not normal. This is not natural. This is not divinely inspired. There's something peculiar about it. And I think that's a bit revealing. It also, for Douglas, is a kind of weaponized rhetorical tool to expose those same absurd inconsistencies of American idealistic expectations and reality. He directs his irony against otherwise obvious, I think, incongruities that remain hidden among enslavers who remain in, to use another existentialist phrase, bad faith or self-deception here. One example of this is to consider the stereotypes that are necessary to rationalize, to normalize enslaving an entire population. In order to do this, you have to perceive them as being less than human, incapable of intellectual endeavors. But at the same time, you could punish a slave for breaking a law. And Douglas puts it well. He says, it is admitted in the fact that Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read and write. That's a fantastical absurdity. And the fact that one had to maintain these laws and at the same time adopt the stereotype that these are less than human as you separate them from their family members, which is, as Douglas later puts, you don't even do this with most animals, is a kind of self-deception that's hard to top. When you add such laws against, teaching the beasts of the field to read and write, then indeed maybe I'll make an argument for my position. He could do an argument. He has in this particular instance the beginnings of a reductio ad absurdum, but I think he remains consistent with his approach of using rhetoric, using irony, using humor. And if I could borrow a little bit from Kierkegaard and his dissertation, The Concept of Irony, that one will make you cry if you read that one. He says, irony requires strong contrast and would utterly vanish in such boring company as argumentation, end quote. That's tough to read if you teach logic. Douglas is using humor here. He's using irony. And I think there are two senses of funny involved here. There's the funny, strange. Something is not quite right. Something is incongruous or dissonant that has been missed and perhaps should not have been missed. And then, of course, there's the funny ha-ha, the mirthful pleasure that accompanies humor. And I think Douglas tries to maintain both of those. And I have a couple of examples. I won't read through all of them here. Here he examines the role of the church in maintaining systematic prejudice. He's quite aware of the role that the church played, and even quotations from the Bible and scriptures for maintaining slavery, a peculiar institution. As you read through this, Mark Twain, a contemporary of Douglas, as might pop into your heads, but it would be an angry Twain. Justifiably, Douglas's humor was often coupled with anger. But I think such an emotion-laden attitude can be socio-politically effective and humorous at the same time. And in fact, the humor is going to play a role in that effectiveness. The perspective shifting that is needed to see from another person's point of view, to just take one example, to see others will likely not come about through explicit argumentation, straightforward, bona fide use of the oppressor's language, for example. Humor is often intentionally ambiguous enough to critique the dominant center through the double or even multi-layered meanings. And we can expand on a cliche, which some of you know I don't care for cliches, but one can speak truth to power and amuse. One can highlight a serious moral incongruity through the lens of playful laughter. You can be funny without being frivolous, and you can be a Parhesiastes and a humorist. In fact, I would argue and will that a Parhesiastes who cultivates a desire to seek out and even enjoy the experience of dissonance, confusion, and doubt, all of which can ignite philosophical thinking, might be the ideal non-violent gadfly, which is, to borrow a phrase from Martin Luther King Jr., referencing how he saw Socrates as the non-violent gadfly. So some of the benefits, I'll get to the quote from Du Bois in a bit, but some of the benefits of subversive humor and Parhesia is this, the previous seminar we had on this concept of the liminal, the borderlands, where meaning can be made in ambiguous spaces, places we would not expect, I think is relevant to here, to this discussion as well. The aesthetic, the emotional, the indirect, the ironic approaches of Douglas and other comedians, as we'll see, I think offer greater hopes of of breaking a populace out of complacency than more direct methods do. The creative, imaginative play with ideas found, for example, in thought experiments in philosophy, fictional narratives and humor, open up the possibility for expanding perspectives, allow us to manipulate otherwise abstract, logical, and moral states of affairs, and even render concrete the, again, lived experiences of others. And if I could skip a little bit ahead here, the comedian is a part of the society in most cases that she critiques, and a lot of comedians critique, not all of them do, that's a discussion we can have. But given the distance emotionally and cognitively afforded by a humorous attitude, the constitution to see the funny side of things, she has a broader perspective. This playful openness is required in order to create and experience mirth, but it's also integral in creating, understanding, and enjoying the critical commentary of parhesiastic humorists. Subversive humorists, they navigate in between worlds, to borrow from Maria Lugones, with deep insight in both the center and the borderlands of society. This, I think, unique positionality, coupled with the playful, creative, and yet critical lens of a humorist, provides a platform for indirectly confronting an otherwise adversarial audience. Now, how is this so? Because it seems in many cases there's an insurmountable dilemma for people who are marginalized through force, through law, through stereotype, even logic and language. If they use the same mechanisms as their oppressors in hopes of instilling change, they often succeed only in buttressing the very systems they wish to undermine. Laws are not constructed with them in mind, except when they are designed intentionally to exclude them. The very language implicitly and explicitly characterizes them as outside of the norm or as substandard. And if they respond in kind to their oppressor's use of force, then they fit the stereotype of the angry, belligerent aggressor. And I'll return to that later with President Obama's anger translator, Luther. That'll make sense later. So if I could borrow from Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, if we adopt that to this particular issue. But on the other hand, should the oppressed try to resist and change the system completely from without the systems, only from the borderlands, assuming a different set of laws, tools, languages, and even logics, well, then they are ignored, they're misunderstood, and they end up sustaining the negative stereotypes depicting them and forcing them to remain as outsiders, foreign, and other. I think Douglas's subversive humors and others takes a middle path. He does not rely upon a private language spoken, for example, only by enslaved people, untranslatable by enslavers or the general white populace. However, there are exceptions to that I can talk about later. Douglas wants to be able to use the language and the moral sentiments found, for example, in the Bible, in Shakespeare, Enlightenment philosophy, Ralph Waldo Emerson, for a few, which are also embedded in the voices of many in the dominant sphere. The enslavers would cite the Bible as justification for their system of oppression, the same Bible from which Douglas learned how to read. And like Martin Luther King Jr. after him, he appealed to it as a higher law in contrast to the unjust laws of the state. Douglas was a fervent Christian for the majority of his life. He didn't repudiate his faith, but he also did not exonerate it. Through his multivalent irony, he was able to navigate between these two poles, critiquing the inconsistencies of the self-proclaimed Christians who supported slavery, while at the same time, I think he remained ensconced within the ethical language of Christianity. Subversive humorists, like those on the margins of society, are both inside and outside simultaneously. And Douglas embodies this in out ambiguity as he recognizes his own freedom that he sees as protected under the Constitution and universally prescribed in the same Bible that the enslavers revere. But at the same time, he's in W.B. Du Bois, finally I get to this quote, a sense of double consciousness. He understands that he does not, in fact, belong. So I think when Du Bois uses this peculiar sensation, looking at oneself through the eyes of others, this is where Douglas, when he says, "It is your birthday," in his 5th of July speech, "It is your birthday. of your national independence and of your political freedom. The 4th of July is yours, not mine. Douglas's moral claims are direct and they are forceful, but the mode of presentation, while surely powerful, could be indirect and even playful at the same time. Direct, bona fide communicative acts have traditionally been used by protesters against injustice. In these cases, the intent and meaning of the language is unambiguous, practically engaged, straightforward, and serious. One strictly adheres to the typical rules of language, logic, and in many cases, the same society that is oppressing. This is to rely, in one way of putting it, on the master's tools. Subversive humor violates these rules, but without falling into frivolity and without the loss of meaningful communication. To focus on language a bit, consider the fact that humor violates most of H.P. Grice's rules of conversational logic, in particular what he calls the cooperative principle or rule. He tells us, do not say what you believe to be false. Well, humorists do that. Do not say that for which you lack adequate evidence. Humorists can do that too, but there's limitations to that. Avoid obscurity of expression. And then I think he's intending to be amusing here. Avoid ambiguity. You can't get rid of ambiguity if you're a humorist. And be brief. And those are his added parenthetical remarks. Be brief. That is to say, if you didn't understand what brief meant, avoid unnecessary prolixity. That's the funniest thing H.P. Grice had ever said. And also be orderly. Most humor is not any of that. It violates that. But that doesn't make the humorist's content, what their words, completely meaningless or nonsense. In addition, violating or flaunting, as Grice uses the term, these rules of conversation, this does not lead to a lack of meaning or even a loss of cooperation between the wit and audience. And in fact, elsewhere I talk about how humor is the most cooperative, collaborative of all the arts. It requires significant interaction with an audience. In fact, a good humorist is able to say a lot with leaving most unsaid, relying upon, and this actually came up in the previous seminar as well, leaving spaces. I guess there's the liminal space, leaving things open for others to fill in what is intended. And that is a kind of cooperation that plays, brings together people in meaning making, if you will. Subversive humor, playfulness, this fosters greater cooperation that might exist without that playful attitude, the constitution to see the funny side, as Douglas puts it, even when this playfulness can be used to expose errors in other people's thinking. The subversive humorist is playfully, surprisingly violating the rules, but the audience will still be able to make and or find meaning out of the wit's purposeful and playful employment of incongruity, absurdity, misuse of language, role reversals, or hyperbolic analogy, for just a few. Through the use of humor, Parhesiastes like Douglas can openly critique an unjust system, toying with the rules that have been contingently as opposed to absolutely or necessarily constructed, showing that they're not inviolable. And you see he takes on the role of trickster, this concept of seeing from different perspectives, because one has to if one is on a member of an oppressed group. Maria Gomez makes this point when she says, when in one world I animate, for example, that world's caricature of the person I am in. She's talking in a way about double consciousness or multi-consciousness, as she would put it. I have images of both. I can have both images of myself, and to the extent that it can materialize and animate both images at the same time, I can become an ambiguous being. This is very much the part of trickery and foolery, end quote. Du Bois focuses upon the more negative elements of double consciousness, I think. But theorists within the existentialist tradition, Emma Ridley-Gone is an example of this, notes the potential positives of double consciousness. And humor is a means of cultivating this perspective taking, in particular for people who might not have to, like myself, for example, have to see from multiple perspectives. The subversive humorist embraces ambiguity, confusion, and even tension, all of which are more closely connected to reality than a presumed logic of purity, necessity, and absolutes, which is the common view of the social world from those on top. I think humor, a near universally desirable emotion, it has its own rules, as Raskin and Attardo point out, that permit a meaningful exchange of ideas, even when the medium and the message of the subversive violate the standard rules of the dominant sphere. To return to Foucault a bit, there are rules to the Parhesiastic Contract, as he calls it. And I would add to that Parhesiastic Contract another one called, borrowing from Jonathan Rossing, the Humour Contract. And one is protected to some extent by becoming a party to this contract. As Foucault puts it, the contract is intended to limit the risk he takes in speaking. But you see this also, this seeming paradox of a participation in a game while being free to play by variations of the rules, even amend them as one goes, oscillating back and forth between games, so to speak. The subversive Parhesiastic humorist manifests an ambiguous state of being in direct and indirect, serious and playful, using the bona fide language of those who subjugate them and the non-bona fide language of the humorist. And you see examples of this. Frederick Douglass has a lot. This is from a speech to the Plymouth County Anti-Slavery Society, 1841. Here he's lampooning the traditional power relationships between the Southern preacher and the slave. And here he's doing a sort of very common move among humorists, a role reversal. He's mocking these social roles that are established and maintained by society. At the same time, he's doing it in a courageous but not a reckless manner. There's irony, there's humor in his tone, his subverting the very language used by his oppressors, turning it against them. He's not merely demonstrating a point, right? This is something that Foucault talks about. Nor is he employing a rhetorical trick divorced from a concern, a genuine concern for truth in an attempt to persuade. Nor is his performance intended to instruct in a purely pedagogical sense. These are terms that Foucault uses. His instruction instead is not filling his audience's head with data that frees them from the presumed exculpating ignorance. As you recall, they've already declared universal equality. His lampooning reversals are more than mere performances intended to get a laugh, but they are also distinct from straightforward argument or protest speech meant to call out members of his audience and society at large. Douglass is mad, but it is not a rage that undermines his reason. In fact, it acts as an emotional motivating force that fosters a laser-like focus on his goals. And we can consider Chris Rock's performance from earlier. He is able to control the rage while not stifling it. His justified rage is counterbalanced in a way by his humorous attitude that are seen in tandem. And we see his rage in the ironic language where he willfully engages in what's known as a performative contradiction or paralipsis, which is a tactic that our former president, alas, was very good at using. Douglass is good at using it too. He gives a speech in part of his 5th of July speech. He's telling us, I wish I could do all of these things. Paralipsis is a really interesting approach. It's where you can say something and then weasel yourself out of it by saying, yeah, but I didn't really say it. I'm not going to mock. I think Reagan did it once too. I'm not going to focus on the youth and inexperience of my competitor, who I forget who that was. You all remember Reagan. Hilarious. When a member of an oppressed group is angry, as Douglass had every right to be, and was, it is interpreted by the dominant center as rage. In rage, unless expressed by the right people, such as white men in power, people like Rush Limbaugh and Alex Jones come to mind. These are perennially, constantly enraged individuals. I think is much manufactured. And if you don't know who either of them are, you're better for it. It's seen as a character flaw, unless you're one of these white men. As Lugones puts it, rage is equated by dominators with hysteria or insanity. However, in becoming angry, subordinates signal that they take themselves seriously. They believe they have the capacity as well as the right to be judges of those around them, end quote. Douglass embodies this potent and directed rage expressed through the playful mechanisms of humor. And this takes us to a transition, pretty big transition, but this conception of rage being an outlaw emotion. We see that with President Obama, where he could not win if he showed too much emotion. He was mocked. He would fit the stereotype of the angry black man. If he didn't show enough emotion, in fact, people complained about that too. It was supposed to be a positive. He's no drama Obama, which is trying to show he's not overly emotional. But they dinged him for that as well. This amusing bit is fantastic. Obama cannot present his anger. And so he has an anger translator, Luther, who comes on and says all the things that's going on in Obama's head that he cannot say. And eventually he gets to the point, this is like 2014, where he talks about climate change and how there's been so little action. And you can see he gets quite angry, even to the point that Luther gets a little bit worried and says, no, you don't need me anymore. But this is a performance, and being presented in a performance enables him to perform his rage. And by performance, that's not to minimize this at all. And I'll come back to this example. I want to make this quick transition now. What Du Bois dealt with, what Fanon dealt with, what Douglas dealt with, was, to borrow from the philosophy of mind, easy problems. In the philosophy of mind, intelligence, perception, vision, hearing, the binding problem, those are easy problems. And the joke here is, of course, they're not easy, but in comparison to consciousness, to first-person subjectivity, they are easy. The hard problem, to connect it to our issue here of oppression, is the kinds of covert, systemic, implicit biases that come out, that are played out in stereotypes that are part of the very culture and society in which we live. And they're perpetrated by those who are well-meaning. And the phrase Gene Harvey uses is civilized oppression, right? This is unlike violent oppression, yet the consequences in so many cases are oftentimes just as negative, just as problematic. And if that's the case, we have a moral dilemma. And you have other examples of this: covert, implicit, subtle oppression, distorted conceptions of others. We see it also with Iris Marion Young's conception, well-intentioned liberalist society, egalitarian society, even woke folk, as I said before, that participate, perhaps unwillingly. This is another element of the moral dilemma, unaware of their actions. And here the Parhesiastes, the humorist, their role is using humor to call out, to bring out, to raise awareness that these are problems that seem obvious to so many, but somehow are lost. I give a couple of examples here, and I'll focus just on this one just for a second. It's significant. The stereotype that goes back to slavery period, that African Americans don't feel as much pain as lighter skinned individuals. And so up to today, they are not prescribed as much pain medication. There's a lot of data on this. And Wanda Sykes, comedian, has a bit on this, pointing out the ironies that they got lucky in that because of bias, systemic oppressive bias against African Americans, they largely avoided the opioid epidemic, which in the United States is predominantly affecting white people. And perhaps because of that, it's called a medical emergency. Whereas the crack epidemic in the 1980s that predominantly affected African American population was more of a criminalized. It was criminalized. It was shown as a criminal problem. She has a double mastectomy. They did not give her opioids. They gave her, that's ibuprofen, as she's pointing out. And she's also angry, presented in her humor. So let me shift then, and we'll wrap up with Chappelle. The United States is the best. Sean Hannity tells us the United States is the single greatest and best country God has given man on the face of the planet. He says that multiple times. If you don't know who Sean Hannity is, again, you're better for it. This should make us surprised when we hear stories like this from Dave Chappelle and his white friend Chip encountering the police while lost and high as shit. My white buddy, he was smoking a joint. Chappelle, as Chip shouts, "Dave, I'm not going to read. I'm not going to live that out or act it out. But the point here is Chip takes a long and then comfortable drag of his marijuana cigarette. And he says, I'm going to ask you for directions. And this is a ridiculous thing to do. He walks over there. He starts touching the police officer, which of course is something you don't do. And he admits that he's high. And then he asks for directions. And it ends, the punchline, if you will, is the cop says, you're on 3rd Street. Now move it. That's it. That's all that happened. You ask some of these black fellas here, that shit is fucking incredible. That's the punchline, that nothing happened. The experience that he's described, this is in 2000, right? This is represented again and again within the last couple of years. We see the difference in treatment between whites and blacks in the US. It should not be news, but it seems in the language that Jason Stanley uses, referring to undermining negative propaganda, reality of the situation doesn't get filtered through. With decades, even with decades of forceful argument, direct protests, highlighting police brutality against black citizens. But I think we can look at this comedic performance and perhaps be encouraged to take perhaps even a first look at something that's always been right in front of us, here expressed in a manner that can evoke a desire to listen empathically to another person's point of view and experience. One message that's obvious is that Black and white people have very different experiences with the police. W.B. Du Bois, to return to him in his work, Critique of Negro Art, says, beauty is essential to art, but I don't care a damn for any art that is not used as propaganda. I do care when propaganda is confined to one side, while the other is stripped and silent. I think this one side is the one that appears to cultivate American ideals, but in reality undermines them. It perpetuates the subordinate status of Black citizens. And I think if you replace in this quote beauty with humor, we start to see striking parallels between some, not all of it, as you'll see, of Chappelle's performances and Du Bois' call for what is referred to as positive propaganda, which is both found in civic rhetoric. Melvin Rogers analyzes Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk in Critique for Negro Art, and he offers a clear conception of civic rhetoric. He says, quote, persuading white Americans to embrace an expanded view of themselves and the political community. The relational and binding quality that Souls of Black Folk seeks to forge follows from making the reader a co-participant in the arrival of a truth that has been hitherto unavailable, end quote. There, I think we see a connection with humor, again, this very collaborative, cooperative art form. Chappelle's civic rhetoric, it's a different kind of propaganda. It's anti-demagogic. Like Du Bois, it appeals to emotion, in particular white audiences' sympathy for the lived experiences of Black folk, but it also is a bit addressing their shame to the extent that it's present, with the recognition of white Americans' failure to, quote, as Rogers puts it, to live up to a standard with which they identify, namely freedom for all, as they've declared it. These truths have always been available, but hidden beneath a kind of negative propaganda. We don't live in Du Bois' America of systemic, explicit denial of rights, although some argue we might be moving that direction. The mechanisms of exclusion are implicit, difficult to dislodge because they are driven by subtle propaganda. Chappelle's comedic art draws attention. Yes.
Chris, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you too much, but we are heading very much towards the end of the session. I thought I better just...
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, goodness. I don't have the clock here. I'm in my daughter's room and I don't... Okay. I should get that. All right, let me... I will skip through a few things. Again, there's some...
We have about 10 minutes or so left.
For the whole thing?
For the whole thing?
Oh, goodness. Well, then let me skip through a few things.
Sorry, I should maybe have mentioned it a bit earlier.
That's all right. That's all right. So let me wrap up here. Chappelle and Rock and Douglas, these are individuals who are justifiably enraged, and we see some of Chappelle's work in his more recent stuff about George Floyd clearly representing a kind of anger, and doing so in a way that makes something that has been normalized, to borrow from Jason Stanley. Here's the quote he has on this on propaganda, what normalization does is transform the morally extraordinary into the ordinary. It makes us able to tolerate what was once intolerable by making it seem as if this is the way things have always been, end quote. Chappelle's bit and others with his white fan Chip, who's high, touching a cop without consequence, at first glance appears to be an everyday normal experience. But Chappelle wants us to view this as intolerable. What his parrhesiastic comedy does, as Shelley says of poetry, is transform what has become morally ordinarily normalized and accepted through negative propaganda into something extraordinary that should compel us to say, that shit is fucking incredible. So that's the end. I skipped a few things, but I apologize for going over. Let me take questions. I'll stop sharing.
Hi, Chris. Shane, thanks so much. Yes, it was a riveting presentation. And yeah, we could have gone on and on and on. I have a few questions, but I'm going to skip over mine and Andrea's questions so that we can give the other people more of a chance. Okay, so I hope you don't mind that. Our first question comes from Brian Wagner. If I can invite you, Brian, to put your camera on and ask Chris your question. I see that Brian's left now. So I'm just going to, so I'm just going to go up here and read it.
Okay.
He asks whether logic is needed to overcome oppression. And in your opinion, isn't there logic embedded in humor used to fight oppression? And would humor be effective in subverting oppression without logic behind it? So I know there's quite a few questions in that one question.
Yes. And I have limited time, but it's a very good question, Mr. Wagner. I know him. Yes, I think humor, in particular, subversive humor, is not without a logical justification. And if it is, then it's more than likely just pure propaganda, more of the negative sort. Oftentimes propaganda is resorted to when there isn't a good reason. Douglas is not saying there aren't any arguments that slavery is wrong. It's just so obvious that to present an argument, to make a deductive proof would be absurd. It would be incongruous. It would be ridiculous, which is different than saying that there isn't a logical basis for the oppressive, the persons who is oppressed, to present their case humorously. Humor and logic are not inconsistent, although, in fact, humor can be used to recognize when there are errors in reasoning. Fallacies are oftentimes amusing, and I think that's not insignificant here. But humor, in particular subversive humor that I focus on here, is an interweaving of both logic, reason, and emotion, rationality and irrationality, dissonance, confusion, but also the capacity to make sense. We know what the humorist is saying, even though they violated so many rules and seem to be speaking irrationally, foolishly, and so forth. But no, they're not necessarily, they're not always opposed.
Thanks so much, Chris. I think you would have been very happy with that answer. I'm going to move on quickly then to Helen Douglas. Helen, can I invite you to just put your camera on? Thank you.
Oh, you're muted, I'm afraid.
Jenna didn't tell me to unmute. She just told me to.
But that's my fault, sorry.
Teasing. You said that woke originally was used in a different context with a different meaning, and I would just like to know what that is.
Right. In the 1920s, there was a case in which the Scottsboro boys, I believe they were called, were accused of perhaps the term that was used, I'm not sure if this is the particular case, reckless eyeballing, which is when a black, often child, looks at a woman. This is what happened to Emmett Till. And they're accused of a kind of transgression, sometimes accused of rape, and then they're either imprisoned, or in the 20s, it was common that they're publicly lynched. And this was in Alabama. At the end of one of Luddy Ledbetter's songs, he's talking in the recording. It's fascinating. And he says, if you're going through Alabama, you need to stay woke. And by that he means you need to be awake, you need to be aware, you need to be present, because it is not a safe place for people like you and me. He's African American. This is 1920s. Ledbetter's a very famous musician that doesn't get a lot of credit. A lot of the songs he wrote, white folk later took it. Now it's transitioned to mean something different. It's now a pejorative from one side of the political aisle, as is identity politics. It's funny, strange how language evolves.
Are you happy, Helen? Okay, that's fine. Okay, Chris, yay, we have some time. So Andrea does get to ask her question.
I'm trying to talk as fast as I can.
No, shame.
No,
Well,
don't worry.
sometimes we wish these sessions would go on and on, but we have to, like, because people have meetings and that afterwards. So
Sure.
yes, we'll have to invite you another time again, sometime, somewhere.
Okay, and I also see that Vulindlela would like to chat. Vulindlela, would you like to chat quickly before me?
Yes, please. I have to rush to a meeting at 3.
Okay.
I thank you for your presentation, Christopher. It was really exciting, and I really like the conversation around the sense of humor and things like that. I'm not a fan of Dave Chappelle because of his transgressions in terms of trans identities and things like that. But the subversive humor and the sense of experiences that people might have where we're told to kind of, people of color perhaps would be told to kind of laugh it off, you know, in other words, to deal with a highly emotive situation and go like, well, that was in the past, I didn't mean it this way, or such and such. And when one then engages in parhesia, I think parhesia, that's a lovely word, I like it. And you have to kind of be, in some ways, cognizant of the what you put up there, the fear of white tears, and white tears being a kind of weaponization of something. So, you know, I'm kind of interested in how subversive humor might counter that aspect of fear of white tears.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. I don't know if I can do that one in 3 minutes. Yeah. So I want to make very clear, I would not say, and I don't think even people like Douglas would, to say, you know, it is a boon. Look at how I have insulated myself and able to use humor as a means beyond mere rhetoric of calling out, raising consciousness. It's used throughout. You see parallels of humor being used against oppression and slavery. You see it by those suffering through the concentration camps against the Nazis. Humor is a powerful tool, as the leaders of tyrants realized this. I mean, there were joke courts in Nazi Germany. You couldn't make jokes at Hitler's expense. In Turkey, I think Erdogan tried to imprison a German comedian at one point for making fun of him. So it works, and I think there's a descriptive element to that, a theoretical element of it, which is different than a prescriptive, and I don't want to do that. And I don't think most people do when they analyze humor. As to how humor can be a means, subversive humor could be a means to avoid the problems of white tears, the kind of reaction of, oh gosh, the kind of fragility. That's interesting. I never thought of that, because, you know, Fanon talks about tears, but in a very different context. And I'm looking at, in the way that Douglas refers to this, you can respond with laughter or with crying. Laughter makes more sense to me. But also the laughter, the humor, can be a means of bringing together audiences who would otherwise not be able to accept a straightforward representation of systemic racism is happening. You are benefiting from systemic racism because of your skin color. Does it make you a racist? Does it make you horrible? But you're benefiting from a system and you're not doing anything about it. So there's a kind of shame that's there. But when it's presented in humor, you've already been brought in. I don't remember who said this. When you get somebody laughing, you can shove the truth in without their awareness. And you may be able to avoid this fragility, the white tears, via humor. That's something I have to think a lot more about. That's a very good question. I have to think more. Thank you for that.
Thanks so much.
I did do it in 3 minutes.
Thanks. I have to dash, I'm afraid, so goodbye.
Thanks very much, Vulindlela. Chris, I have to say, I love that last answer of yours. Really fantastic. It made me think about certain things in a different way as well. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to hand over to Andrea now quickly. so she can ask her last question.
Okay.
Thanks, Jenna. Okay, it's just a quick question. You sort of answered it a little bit, but it was about the Obama thing where, I mean, I've kind of heard it said that he's not allowed to be angry about racism as well as an American president. So he had to kind of compromise on his anger about racism. And then, okay, maybe your answer might be that he could potentially have negotiated this via subversive humor. And it looks like in one of your, I mean, this was slightly later on in the presentation, you sort of answered me and said, well, look, actually he did. But how effective is that? How, I mean, I don't know if that's something you can answer or not for me, but would subversive humor have enabled him to kind of convince like the ordinary American right of his legitimacy as a president?
Very good. Oh, that's a tough one. Would he be able to convince the right? Well, it depends. If we're talking about the Trump type right, which it's unclear that he's on the right or where he is, he's for himself. The birthers, as they're called, it's unclear that any evidence, any mode of presentation, any argument, anything would convince them. That they're beyond convincing, I think, as the evidence has shown over the years. And so it's not that humor is a failure in that regard, it's that everything is a failure in that regard.
Yes, good.
And additionally, he's president of the United States. I would say he was president of the United States, legitimately, therefore the most powerful man in the world. So he has to be very careful with using humor. Parhesia from a president, that is inconsistent, I think Foucault would say. So there's a lot more I have to say about that. It was a very good question. I had actually thought of, can a president of the United States be a Parhesiastes? Maybe, if he's a member of a group that has been traditionally and continually oppressed, perhaps.
Yeah, but yes, thank you. That was actually a good short answer. Chris, thank you very much. I mean, we unfortunately do have to, unless Jenna, I mean, we could sneak another few minutes if you want to just quickly chat about what you wanted to chat about.
I'm not going anywhere. Let's sit back to sleep.
I'm just trying to get up to my question here. I'm so sorry, Chris. Oh, yes. I just wanted to know more about the humour contract you spoke about. If you could just elaborate a little bit for me on that.
Right. Yeah, contract is an interesting word. I get that Jonathan Rossing, he has a really good paper on the connections of Parhesia with Richard Pryor. So I would encourage that reading of that paper. The Parhesiastic Contract is, as Foucault talks about it, there's a recognition that you are speaking with, there's risk, but it's mitigated by this recognition of a kind of relationship between those with power and those without. But with humor, which I think Foucault does not focus upon, there's a contract in the sense of there's a collective recognition that there's a performance happening. There's a collective recognition. If I could, I mean, just a simple example of, hey, have you heard this one? You know, we're non-bona fide language. We're beyond straightforward argumentative representation. Now this gets complex online because, you know, sarcasm online is notoriously difficult to discern. I think it's called Poe's law, where if I'm being humorous, satirical, let's say about a position from a creationist, this is where Poe's law comes from. The satirist perspective of creationism, like John Oliver or Stephen Colbert taking on a role, is indistinguishable from the real perspective. And so the humor contract isn't always signed, so to speak, by everyone involved, but it's an implicit contract. It's an implicit recognition that there's a different set of rules in a way, which is problematic for various reasons, but you recognize you're in a different sphere that, as some would argue, is separate from reality, separate from the real world, emotionally connected, serious world. I disagree with that. I think the two intertwine, otherwise subversive humor would be irrelevant. And in fact, they intertwine in a way that shows that oppressive humor, humor against those that it's punching down, would also be, oh, it's just humor. We're part of a contract now, therefore I can say any damn thing I want. As the gentleman earlier was talking about Chappelle being problematic because of his stance on LGBTQ populations and his jokes at their expense. He doesn't have to do that. And he might say, you are part of this humor contract such that you watch my shows, you watch my videos, therefore I have different set of rules here. And I'm a Parhesiastic, a Parhesiast with respect to my free speech, Chappelle might say. In fact, he does make that case. He argues for free speech in justifying a lot of his material that's problematic. But there's a lot there. That was, yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks so much, Chris. You just clarified it all for me, and I really want to read a bit more on that and more of the scholars. I've made so many notes here on my piece of paper. So thank you for giving me a lot of extra reading to do over the weekend.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so we will definitely have to end now. And again, a huge thanks, Chris. We could actually listen to you for weeks. It's been really fascinating. And yes, I really hope that at some point we'll be able to gather together and have a really good seminar or a conference on humor. And
Let me suggest the Lighthearted Philosopher Society. It's a wonderful group of people.
Oh, excellent. Good suggestion. All right.
Yeah.
And we'll put that up on YouTube. And okay, so thank you. Thanks again. Thank you very much for joining us at the crack of dawn. And what we'll be looking at next week is psychology and humor. So humor as defense mechanism. I think that will also be an interesting part of this conversation about reasoning and emotion. That the two are incredibly intertwined. And there is no, I think that Chris is absolutely right. There's no reasoning sometimes. And then perhaps you have to start tapping into emotion, and humor is a good way to do that. Okay, so thanks so much for listening, everybody, and joining in with us, and hopefully see you all next week. Okay, bye.
Thank you.